1 Corinthians 10:27 through 11:1. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I take part in a meal with thankfulness, why am I being denounced because of something I thank God for? So, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of the many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So this brings an end to the discussion that began 2 chapters ago in chapter 8 on Christian freedom. The verses that we'll go over on Sunday begin in 23. There's some important pieces there. But basically what Paul has said in those verses is, if you go to the meat market, don't ask about where the meat came from. Just eat it because everything is clean. And then he gets into this second example over here, which is very closely related to the first. So here is the first example. If, hypothetical scenario, an unbeliever invites you to a meal, so that's condition 1, condition 2, invites you to a meal, and you want to go. Whoopsie. There's a and there. Bloop. And you want to go. That's the third condition. Then, bloop, you got these 3 conditions. If these 3, and then you could supply here, then. And what you really get is an if-then statement. Then do this. Eat whatever is put before you, and here's the key part, without raising questions of conscience. So obviously it's okay to ask questions, but questions that will potentially lead to the violation of someone's conscience. If you're going to go to an unbeliever's home, just eat whatever they put before you without asking matters of conscience, questions of conscience. And so that could be a variety of things, really. But what's really being thought of here is origins of the meat. Don't ask something that could potentially lead to someone's conscience being upset. And in the context of what they're talking about here, particularly, it would be to say to this person that you're eating with, is this food sacrificed to an idol? That person would say, "Oh, yes, you're right. You know what? And you're a Christian. Isn't that a problem for you guys? Isn't that a sin for you guys? Or I'm so sorry." Or even though it's a sin, can we still eat? And you could see how there would be some scenarios that would play out from that could lead to someone violating their conscience. Whether it's a Gentile who's now emboldened to give meat sacrifice to idols to other Christians, or if it does the opposite, if it takes a Gentile and it makes them not care about doing this. Both of those things are not really ideal. So you want to just eat what's before you without raising questions of conscience. Now that example number 1 is contrasted with example number 2. In example number 1, you don't care and the person doesn't seem to care. But in example number 2, and this but tells us that this is kind of the opposite of the previous one. So we got our if-then construction. Says, if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice." And so I think what we're doing is we're assuming that 1, 2, and 3 are also part of this, but you have an additional 4th piece. Is you sit down, and when you get ready to eat, they say, "This food has been offered to Poseidon," right? Again, this someone we're assuming here is an unbeliever. Then do not eat it. And now we have a straight up if-then construction. Then, and here's your command this time, do not eat it. And then that leads to the question, why? Both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. Boom. For the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. You don't want to lead that person to do something that they think is sinful. And so in Paul's mind, the reason that this unbeliever is giving you this piece of information is they want to make sure that this is okay. It would be like someone, you're having a Muslim person over for dinner and you're like, you know what? I cooked this with butter. Is that okay? And that's because, that Muslims can't eat pork. And so, you're just making sure here on this butter issue, right? So this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it, because this question of conscience, it's in the air. And Paul's whole thing on this is better safe than sorry. And so to make it simple, he's just like, yeah, just don't eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. And he throws this matter out, the sake of conscience, kind of in general at first. And then he quickly specifies this question. So you might ask, whose conscience? And whose conscience? And then he kind of gives us the answer right over here. I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. Which is kind of funny because he said, for the sake of the one who told you. And he doubles down on that, for the sake of their conscience, not yours. Paul's not worried about you doing something that you think is sinful in this matter because the food is okay to eat. He's really thinking about this unbeliever's conscience. And he doesn't want to embolden them to lead other Christians into sin, or even in this moment to do something that they would think is sinful. Even if it's from a misunderstanding, even if they don't understand that the Christian can eat this, Paul doesn't want them to violate their conscience. And then this whole thing takes a really strange turn. Right here, Paul uses the word for. Now, normally the word for would be somehow building upon what came before. So we would expect Paul to start talking about this other person's conscience, not ours. But all of a sudden, Paul begins to talk about his conscience. So this really introduces Paul's conscience and other Christians. And it takes a really interesting turn. He says, and he asks the question, why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? Why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? My freedom here absolutely refers to eating whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. And similarly, we don't have it in these verses, but in 23 through 24, Paul will make the case about doing the same thing at the marketplace, to buy food without asking where it came from, without raising questions of conscience. And so it's strange because this 4 doesn't so much connect to 27 through 28. The 4 really connects back to 23 through 24. Because Paul's not talking about exercising freedom in 27 through 28 as much as he is talking about conscience. And so now when he brings up my freedom, he's saying the freedom to eat whatever is put in front of me without asking. The freedom to buy anything in the market without asking. He's free to do this. Why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? And here he's certainly thinking of a believer, not an unbeliever. And he's thinking of a believer here who would be upset with him for exercising his freedom. And so just to kind of explain why this would be the case, Jewish Christians would have kept their Jewish habits, and Jews would have always asked about the origins of meat. Because they're used to, meat sacrifice being sacrificed to idols being unclean, and you couldn't eat it. And so we can imagine that there were these Jewish Christians who would say, hey, that's unclean, you can't do that. And when Paul doesn't ask in the marketplace, he could unintentionally buy meat sacrificed to idols. And they're like, Paul, you shouldn't do that. And so when Paul goes into a Gentile's house and he eats a meal, or he goes to the marketplace and he buys food and he eats it, these other Jewish Christians are judging, they are judging him. And so Paul will kind of defend himself right here with this simple question. If I take part in a meal with thankfulness, and this is really important because this is, God's glory here. If I'm eating a meal that's been sacrificed to an idol for God's glory, in the preceding verses again, 23 through 24, he makes the case that, the whole world is God's. So meat, you can't eat it in a temple to another God because that's fellowship with another God. But as soon as it leaves, and you're not doing that, false fellowship with an idol, then you can eat the meat. And saying, so if I'm eating that meat with thankfulness, I'm eating this meat to the glory of God, even if it has been sacrificed to Poseidon. I don't care. I don't know. It doesn't matter. This meat is good. He asks the question, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? So if I'm being judged because of something I thank God for, if I'm being judged for doing something that is genuinely to the glory of God, this isn't right. That's essentially what Paul's saying. So he will eat meat sacrificed to an idol in his house, even if some other Jewish Christian is judging him, even if a Jewish Christian's conscience is judging him, because Paul knows that there's no sin in what he's doing and that he's genuinely thanking God for it. So we arrive at this really interesting line where Paul doesn't want to lead someone to violate their conscience by encouraging them to sin, but Paul also doesn't feel that he needs to take care of the conscience of a believer if they're judging him for something that he's doing for God's glory. And that becomes the guiding principle. Because we could get to a place where every action is completely dictated by another person's conscience. But hey, if they're judging me for doing something to the glory of God, that's not something that I need to protect my brother from. That's essentially what Paul's saying here. That this is actually a wrong action. That's an evil action. I don't need to own that by not eating this meal that I'm thanking God for, because I'm not sinning in that. This is very different than eating in the temple to Poseidon, because in this case, the very act of eating in the temple is it's fellowship with an idol. And that is sinful, right? So that's inherently sinful, so we can't do that. But eating meat outside of the temple, not inherently sinful. It's a matter that we are free to do. And Paul says, well then, hey, I'm going to enjoy this. Now, I think obviously with Paul in particular, he's going to go to that person who's judging him. He's going to try to build them up in love. If he's eating a meal with that person, he's not going to try to violate their conscience. But when it comes to his own exercise of personal freedoms, he's not going to stop himself because another Christian is judging him. And that becomes the guiding line for us. So I know it's really confusing, but that's kind of the message here in this. And that's the early in this whole thing. I said there's going to be an exception to this rule. And here's the exception to the rule. Right here, verse 29. And really picking up, in the second half of 29. 29b through 30. Okay, so, and this so really serves to wrap things up. Here we go. He's going to close out his argument. So, whether you drink or whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, here's the command: do it all for the glory of God. So, eating and drinking. We've talked about this with idolatry. Drinking, he didn't get into the alcohol issue, but that's another issue that was certainly part of what's going on in the church. And then he's like, and by the way, this applies to all of life. Whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Now, if you can genuinely do it for the glory of God, then you're rocking. Can I eat in Poseidon's temple for God's glory? And the answer is no. No, you cannot, because it's idolatry. But can I eat meat that was sacrificed to Poseidon in the marketplace? And then the answer is yes. Yes, I can, because I'm eating it with thankfulness and because it's not been made unclean. The meat isn't unclean, so I can do it. All right, so that's the guide there, and then you could apply this to all of life, and that could deal with every matter of question in Christian freedom. Here's our next command. Do not cause anyone to stumble. And you might say, whoa, hey, what about this up here, about another's conscience? Paul, aren't you causing someone to stumble when you eat meat sacrificed to an idol? And Paul is thinking here of, again, back to chapter 8, verse 9, that you can that you can do something that you think you're free to do and lead someone else into sin by encouraging them to violate their conscience. And that's what Paul means by stumbling here. So don't cause anyone to stumble. Where it gets really interesting is whether Jews, Greeks, what? Or the church of God. Now, we focus our time here, but Paul's also making a point that Jews and Greeks are people that we don't want to cause to stumble. In fact, when we look at Romans chapter 2, we see that men, apart from the law, will be judged on the basis of their conscience. And so I don't want to make anyone's time in hell worse, right? I'm going to preserve their conscience. It's the loving thing to do. And so Paul now gets into his own personal example here. So this is kind of the general rule. And then over here, he gets into his personal example. Personal example. Which, remember, he went into great depth in during chapter 9. And so this is kind of a reference back to that. Even as I try to please everyone in every way. Remember when he said, I become all things to all people? This is kind of a mirror of that. For, and this is like a more normal use of the word for. It very much connects the previous thought to the next one. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of the many. Remember that Paul wants to save as many people as he possibly can, so that they may be saved. And then here's that final command. Follow my example. Now, if we do that, what are we going to end up doing? We're going to end up seeking the good of the many so that they may be saved, which is what we want to do. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And so Paul, his example is the example of Christ. When Paul tells us elsewhere in the New Testament to imitate him, it is always as he is imitating Christ or following the example of Christ. And that's really cool because what Paul does, Paul imitates Jesus for the first century Corinthian. If a Corinthian is wanting to know what does it look like to live like Christ, that's what Paul's doing. Paul is giving them that example, and we want to do the same thing. We want to be a 21st century American Jesus. We want to live like Christ would in our context. And so when other new Christians are coming down the road and they want to know how can I follow Jesus, we can be able to say to them, follow my example. This is a high standard, a high calling. It's one that we should pursue without arrogance. It's really how elders and pastors should live their lives. And I think it's a wonderful goal for all of us to strive to. And if you do it, man, you will be using your Christian freedom the right way to seek the good of the many, not to satisfy our own temptations, not to satisfy our own desires, not to justify our sin, but instead to reach as many as we possibly can. That is the best use of Christian freedom.